Hello and welcome to Thank You for Spore-ing, episode 4. This is the show that probably also would have taken that shortcut through downtown Kansas City. I mean, to just double back, such a waste of time. We've just seen and we'll be talking about HBO's The Last of Us, episode 4, an episode titled Please Hold On to My Hand. Joining me this week, as always, Chad Hopkins. Chad, how are you?
I'm doing well, Eric. How about you?
Good. I'm thrilled. This was another really satisfying episode, another episode that was good to watch, another episode that was enthralling in places and really just kept me loving this adaptation.
Agreed. I do want to issue a small correction because it's called Please Hold to My Hand. There's no on.
There's no on. I wondered if that was
no
a typo. Because hang on, because I'm looking at...
So this is taken from the lyrics of a song that we hear both in the game, and we heard it in a trailer earlier in 2022. And then obviously in this episode by Hank Williams, the lyrics are, "Alone and forsaken by fate and by man. Oh Lord, if you hear me, please hold to my hand."
Okay, IMDb that I'm looking at has it wrong. Thank you for the correction. Yeah, please hold to my hand, whatever it's called, based on the song by Hank Williams. What a great song to have brought from the game. I have another message about that regarding the closing song as well, which we'll get to talking about. But Alone and Forsaken is the name of the chapter in the video game, in the original Last of Us game as well, for what ends up being the Pittsburgh section of the game. And Pittsburgh has been changed to be Kansas City, something that I expect would have generated a little bit more discussion on our part if it weren't for the behind the scenes, which aired along with this episode, where I think it was either Mason or Druckmann that just said, Kansas City looked a lot more like what we had, which was
right up in Calgary.
Yeah. So the change, not important. Ultimately, I'm back on board with, as a Pennsylvania boy, I would have liked to have seen some PA, but it did.
That's fair. See, I was over here thinking, like, I don't care where they stop as long as the same story stuff happens.
Yeah.
And that's, what we got. But as a Pennsylvania person, okay.
I'm a Pennsylvania person. And I say, damn it. It did look like we saw either the Fort Pitt Bridge or a bridge that looked a lot like it. The bridge that goes out of Pittsburgh across the river. So yay for that. But in general, it doesn't really matter. The idea is they're on the way to Wyoming. To visit Joel's brother Tommy, recruit, whatever it is. And so it doesn't necessarily matter. I thought the change was fine.
Yeah, and honestly, going from this episode, which is episode 4, to next episode, which is episode 5, and officially past the halfway point of season 1, it makes sense that we'd be a little bit further along than Pennsylvania, I think, because that would ultimately not be very far from where they started off after... for 3 previous episodes. So
no, it's a great point. With only 5 episodes to go, and thinking that, based on the end of this episode, they're still there. They're still firmly in Kansas City with no known way out. We're going to be there next week, probably, at least, for sure.
Right.
Still. So yeah, it makes sense that it's a little bit further west to have set this episode. But moving on, before we go into the rest of episode 4, we always like to touch base at the beginning of this show and just ask, was there anything more from the Bill and Frank episode, last week's amazing episode 3, that came throughout the week that we didn't get to touch on our last episode, or something that you wanted to mention regarding that?
Well, there's something that I had in my notes that I saw you have in your notes on the Google Doc as well, which is that it's been so great over this last week seeing the internet just completely fawn over episode 3 and Bill and Frank's story.
Yeah.
even in real life, my IRL friends who are watching commented on this episode whenever I'd bring up The Last of Us, and everybody's like, oh, and wasn't episode 3 so good? Like, everybody loves it. And I am just so happy because I hope that that kind of story brings in more people. And not just to the show, but also to the games, because we see what kind of storytelling the medium is capable of. Because even though episode 3 wasn't based entirely on events and things that took place within the game, that kind of storytelling is all over The Last of Us. So,
yeah, I completely agree. And that's only even truer with part 2,
right,
which is quite a degree bleaker than part 1, but has a lot more of very interesting and similar representation. Yeah, I'm seeing just nothing but very positive things from the people I know surrounding episode 3, and I think it really did lead to that. I'm waiting for the report, but I'm pretty sure that episode 4 will probably have record viewers because of the boost. I think, probably people were telling each other episode 3, this is, you got to get on this show, and then people watch that and we're like, oh yeah, we got to get on this show, and then I just expect the audience to have a big boom.
Yeah, absolutely. The only other thing I had to mention regarding like last week's episode, and it's maybe not even last week's episode specifically, but I wanted to give you the opportunity, Eric, since we have Jeffrey Pierce in this episode.
Oh God.
Did you want to
Did I want to
up...
issue a correction? You're like, Chad's like leading me to the water. Can you make me drink to offer this correction? Yeah, well, I texted you an embarrassment because it turns out I watch 3 recap YouTube videos period per week. And it's the Screen Crush guy, Ryan Airy, who I've mentioned before, the heavy spoilers guy, and I throw it out there for like a third, whether it's on YouTube or I watch the official podcast. Those are probably my 3 sources every week. So I don't know how I was duped, but I swear I heard somewhere that Jeffrey Pierce, who was a voice actor for Tommy in the video games, was the radio guy that Joel goes and sees in Boston QZ in the premiere episode. Turns out that's not the case. And in fact, Jeffrey Pierce, who does have a role on the Last of Us series, has a more substantial role in this guy named Perry that is, as we found out this episode, Kathleen's sort of right-hand man and muscle, the guy with the gun that knows there's something very sinister happening with the foundation of one of the buildings in downtown Kansas City. A much more substantial role. And while it would have been fun as like a cameo to see Joel asking Tommy if he can locate Tommy on the radio, like that would have been a fun thing for me. Again, I don't know where I heard this, but it's going to be even better to see him more in action, especially because he looks like he fits perfectly in this world. So that is a correction. I know I did say, and I even created the graphic for it, if you're watching this on YouTube, of this guy, Jeffrey Pierce, Perry, as the radio guy. That was not the case. Thank you for this opportunity to correct ourselves.
You're welcome. Honestly, I probably didn't even like totally remember that you said that. And wouldn't have said anything except for that you came and confessed to me, and so I wanted to give you the opportunity.
Because I couldn't tell if you were humoring me or not, because I remember saying it and you were like, "Oh, I didn't hear that," and I was like, "Oh, is he just being nice because he knows it's bullshit?"
No, I mean, honestly, I had no clue. I thought, for all I knew, you were telling me the truth.
Yeah, well, for all I knew, I was telling you the truth. So it turns out. But anyway, the other thing that I had noticed, so you know this as well, I'm streaming the game online, also going on, that reminds me, I have to put part 2 up on YouTube, the Pittsburgh stuff in The Last of Us, and particularly I'm playing The Last of Us so-called part 1, the newest remaster that's for PlayStation 5. I've been streaming on Twitch just occasionally to keep up with the show and to refresh myself about what happens in the game, because I could use that refresher. So I did just finish playing through the Pittsburgh era of the game. And one thing I noticed, actually, and this relates directly to episode 3, was the conversation that Joel and Ellie have around the mass grave about dead people don't get infected. That line, it turns out, is straight out of the game, but actually it's said as they're literally entering Pittsburgh in the game. And so they come up against, I guess, just a highway where these cars have been bottlenecked. Not too dissimilar from what we see in the episode itself for episode 4. But that is when they have a discussion about the QZ and people, and kind of people being shot down and people being killed before their time, so to speak, as a result of the growing insecurity around the cordyceps infection and pandemic. So it was really interesting to see that show up almost before its time in the show. I kind of wasn't prepared for the gears to turn that way, where they're like bringing in lines for the show earlier that then, pay off in different ways, because of course they could have had that same conversation this week, only this week was focused on just totally different stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we've said that I have not played this recently. I remember all the salient points, but I wouldn't have known that was dialogue straight out of the game. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And I think that can be the thing that sort of transitioned us into talking about this week's episode, because one of the first things we see in this episode is Ellie has the joke book.
There's
she has
so
the joke
much
book from the game.
There's so much stuff in episode 4 that is straight from the game, and it's compatible with our spoiler policy, since we're now at this episode to be talking about the similar moments from the game. So yeah, why don't you lead us off? So the joke book is here. The do you have the title of it? The World's Greatest Puns Part 2 by something Livingston.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
I love that they brought it in. I had a book or two of puns when I was a kid around Ellie's age. That I used to carry around. I think it was called Kids Are Punny, and I'm pretty sure it was like compiled by Rosie O'Donnell, which is nothing wrong with her, but times have changed, right?
Yeah.
And I love how each time she tells a joke in this episode, Joel softens a bit. Like the first time he's like, okay, you can go wait in the car, And then as we go through the episode, she tells a few more jokes. As they get to the end, it ends with them having a really nice, almost normal moment in what they assume is a safe space. And they're just laughing at a terrible joke about diarrhea together. And I mean, that's the way to form relationships.
It's a hearty laugh, scatological humor. Yeah. It's just, but it is the gradual softening of not stools, but of their hardness towards each other.
Oh
Sorry,
gosh,
you were just, for anybody watching on the video, Chad was just about to take a sip of coffee when I said that. Sorry, walk it off. But anyway, this gradual softening of the jokes of their personalities around each other, it works. It just works. And Ellie's persistence is straight out of sort of what we know her character to be from the game. She does not relent, and her questioning Joel about hope in this episode I found to be super relevant. The parts that aren't straight out of the game, I almost want to use the term, I was thinking about this earlier, straight out of the show, because the ideas of these characters are fully fleshed out. We may not be as privy to them as previous players, but the types of conversations that Joel and Ellie are having that didn't happen in the game, that are happening in the show, are clearly, like very, very, very crystal clearly, meant to indicate to us exactly where those characters are coming from or what they're thinking behind their eyes. So the conversation about hope, which I can't recall as being from the game, was very important, not just as a touch base for the audience, like will this be a hopeful show, but it shows that Ellie is really holding on to this sense of humanity that Joel has kind of just thrown away, or at this point is no longer in touch with.
Right. And I mean, there's even a moment where Joel tells tiny bit of a joke himself when they get out the sleeping bags, and Ellie's like, hey, this one smells kind of nice. And Joel's like, well, that one must have been Frank's. So that's funny. But something else to point out about Joel softening in this episode is that despite what he said at the end of episode 3 about how we don't even need to discuss our past or about people that came before this moment in our lives, he full on tells her about Tommy and about how they got to Boston and how they met Tess and what happened to Tommy and where he is now and what is going on, without like being badgered too much. He just offers that information. So I think he's softening to her. He's in want of conversation, and is opening up.
I can see fans of the video game being of the thought that this might be too soon for Joel to open up. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do think that there was a moment where internally I was like, oh, in this scene, he would probably stick to his guns and be like, no past stuff. Don't talk to me. Don't do it. I think we get that in Ellie. She refuses to talk about the circumstances during which she may or may not have shot someone before. So she's still a little bit reluctant to talk as openly about her past. But ultimately, Joel telling her about Marlene and Tess and Tommy and how they all fit in was crucial. We know it did have to happen at some point as a result of where the season's going, what characters we're going to be meeting on our journey in the future. So it did fit in this episode, but it did strike me as being a little bit of like oh, Joel is actually not sticking to what he said. And it seems like there wasn't enough of an inciting incident to have him to kind of decide, oh, okay, I'll tell her. Except that he's just having a nice time. I feel like this is the kind of Joel, like TV Joel can actually just have a nice time sometimes.
Well, it's also just a really long drive, as she points out. She's like, well, we've got 25 hours. Is a story longer than 25 hours?
Yeah.
And I guess Joel still has hope that Tommy is alive, so he has no reason for this to be like an overly sensitive memory. It's not like he's talking excessively about Sarah, which Ellie has no idea about at this point.
That's right.
He's not talking excessively about Tess. Those are just mentioned, and then he just gives her relevant information about where Tommy is, who Tommy is, how he got to where he is, and why we're going to go to save him or whatever we need to do with him.
Yeah. It is still more of an overview. I think you're right. And there would have been topics that are off limits, like Sarah.
Right.
Do you get the impression that he really, when he looks at Ellie, he sees Sarah or realizes that there's somebody that occupies that sort of spot or is about to for him?
By the end of the episode, maybe. Towards the beginning, not yet. And the reason for that is, I mean, other things going on that we'll talk about. We see that Joel is not infallible in this episode. We see his flaws properly give way. He's old. He's 56. He tires easily. He almost gets killed and would have if Ellie had not been there to save him.
Yeah, it was her
and
him.
So
there's
the scene where they're camping in the woods and Ellie's like, nobody's going to find us, right? And Joel's like, yeah, nobody's going to find us. And she believes him. And she has no reason at the end of the episode to doubt necessarily that Joel is not being truthful or is not going to be able to protect her. But she has a little bit more of that doubt because she's like, well, I've noticed that you don't hear as well out of your right ear. Are you sure you're going to be able to hear if somebody sneaks up on us with that glass? And turns out, guess what? He wasn't able to hear.
Guess what? I mean, Henry and Sam, Squee, that's awesome. I like that. I can appreciate that this was more than a one-part episode that involved these characters, that there will be future growth. And in fact, they were just a surprise at the end, which that's awesome. That's the right way to do that. Still, it's possible they sidestepped the glass, but yeah, the question is there. Is Joel fallible, as you say, and is he capable of protecting her? At this point, we've seen him be set up as the protector. Even Bill from Beyond the Grave is like, this is who we are. We're protectors. But the idea that Joel may not be up to the task, even if he is willing, could he protect her because of his ailments, because of his injuries? That's a great question. And it's a great point in the midpoint of the season to be like, could he if he wanted to? Because will he fail is kind of the suspense that I think they're really trying to show here.
Right. And a small attention to detail that they had was when Ellie points out that it's his right ear that he doesn't hear out of as well. Whenever he wakes up at the very end, as we get that reveal that Henry and Sam are there, he has turned over and his right ear is the one facing up. And
man,
that's why he didn't hear. He rolled over.
Because I watched him go to bed with his right ear down. And I was like, oh, good for Joel. He's playing to his strengths. But I turn over in my sleep. I mean, what are you gonna do? So all of that is awesome. Let's getting back to sort of the beginning of the episode, and there's this scene where Ellie is looking into the mirror and she's trying out her gun for the first time. I'm glad they didn't do the Travis Bickle Taxi Driver, you talking to me? Only because Ellie would have absolutely not known that reference at all. So it's funny because it serves as a reference. I like, you get Taxi Driver. If anybody's seen Taxi Driver, seen Marty McFly rip it off in Back to the Future 3, it's the whole standing in a mirror with a gun going pew, 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 pew. 100% total reference, but I like that it wasn't that they didn't make Ellie like be wise beyond her years, that she did it
Right.
without knowing that she was doing it necessarily. It's
Hmm.
like the best of both worlds.
Well, she's sitting there or standing there looking at herself in the mirror, holding a gun, thinking she's a badass.
Yeah.
And like she's like, man, this is the coolest thing ever. I've got the secret gun that Joel doesn't know about.
Yeah.
And then that flips as she's forced to use it, as we predicted in the last episode. When she got the opportunity to prove to Joel that she should have maybe had a gun all along, or question mark, should she have? Because um the idea is brought up in this episode that she's too young. She she it's unfair that she had to do this kind of thing at such an early age and sort of go through this trauma. And um it's a really terrible scene because this is the point where they have made it to the city. They've been run off the road, crashed into the building. Joel has killed the other two people, and then this third guy has snuck up. And Ellie, who was hiding, comes out, shoots the guy, and he doesn't die right away. And so rather than it just being over with, she gets to hear this kid ask for his mother. She gets
Yep.
to hear this kid say, "Why can't I move my legs?" She gets to hear this kid say, "No, please, we can be friends. I promise. Just let me live." And that is its own set of traumatizing, aside from just having shot him, to be responsible for those thoughts that he's asking for. Um, that, I mean, it's tough for anybody. And that's another thing I had in my notes is like, this is a time of unfairness. It's not fair that Joel has had to do this at any point in his life, no
Yeah.
matter his age.
That's really the market departure for me from the video game is when Ellie brings out that she has a gun and she uses it to shoot a guy who's going to kill Joel. Joel in the video games does not acknowledge immediately the significance, nor does he ever tell her that she should not have had to do that. He does not talk about her innocence. He doesn't talk about her age, about it being unfair, the world being unfair, that she's too young, she shouldn't have to do this. None of that. It's possible that video game Joel is thinking that, but
Hmm.
they've really brought that to the forefront because in the game, he's still an asshole to her. He takes the gun, but it isn't like a come on, give me the gun, and she hands it over wordlessly like in the show. In the
Hmm.
game, it's like, no, you give me that. You shouldn't have done that. And she's like, well, but you're glad I did, right? And he's like, no, you shouldn't have done that. And it takes some time for him to be like, you're right. It was either him or me, like whatever. And he doesn't even ever say thank you. She says, you're welcome. But that's when she's going to do the whole sniper rifle scene. So I just feel like in the game, uh, he's much less emotionally open than he is in the show, and it's working for the show because this is a human being.
Hmm.
But it is a different Joel when you start adding up all the moments in which he's able to say things like, you shouldn't have to do this at your age.
Hmm.
He knows by now, surely after 20 years of living in this world, that this is what the world is like. So the fact that he's reminiscing, or the fact that he's looking back and going, it shouldn't be this way, shows that he's way further along on the path of returning to what he was like in sort of pre-fungal infection devastation apocalypse than he was at this point in the game.
I agree, but I think another way of looking at it is that he is so desensitized to this that he doesn't think about the craziness of him having to do it, is instead
Mm,
focusing on the fact that a child is having to do it. So it's just like another step removed. Like it's absurd that Joel, a citizen who was doing carpentry repairs or whatever he was
right,
doing in Texas,
right.
like why does he have to go around killing people? He shouldn't have to. And it's a fact of his life for the at this point. He's been doing it for 20 years whenever he's had to, or apparently sometimes when he hasn't had to. And
Right.
that's just the reality of it for him. He's desensitized to the fact that he does this kind of thing now. And so his focus is on the fact that she's a kid having to do it. And that, so I agree. Yes, it's a different kind of motivation. It's a different kind of way for Joel to approach the situation in here versus the video game. But it's just highlighting a different issue.
I love that, seeing it as like a reflection, or like a like he's looking out instead of looking in these
Right.
moments. And so the
And
fact that he's, yeah, that's real good.
And something that we speculated on in the last episode was why doesn't Joel want Ellie to have a gun? Like, what is his hang up? Like,
Right.
is it such a bad idea for her to have some form of
There's
protection
a
aside from a
wall of
knife?
them, dude.
Yeah. And it broke my heart. Like we said, maybe he's scared of her. Maybe he doesn't trust her. Like,
Sure.
she's a kid. Why give her a gun? Because she might accidentally shoot it. Like, I mean, we see that in America nowadays. That's different. But it broke my heart to learn that Joel wasn't keeping her from having a gun because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't want her to be traumatized by the reality of having to use it. That that
Yeah.
was that was the tough thing for me. Like,
Yeah.
wow, he was looking at this differently than I thought he was, and I appreciate that because I mean, from the beginning of the show, we have been talking about how Joel is like emotionally stunted. He lost his daughter 20 years ago and kind of hasn't grown up from it. In the emotional ways, he's had to grow up in other ways, as we just talked about, the desensitizing himself to killing and hurting people when necessary. So for him to say she's not going to have a gun because I don't want her to have to use it
Yeah.
to go through that traumatization that I have gone through.
That shows that he took on the protecting of Ellie far beyond just a charge. I know he calls her just cargo, even in this episode, or cargo. But it shows that he wanted to protect her innocence. He wanted to preserve so much more than just her life here. He wanted her to never have to fire a gun on somebody who was pretending to be her when they weren't. And um, that is so much more than just saving her life or just ferrying her across the country and getting rid of infected. And what I just had as a thought hit me like a lightning bolt when you're talking is he might have regressed back to this exact same area that Sarah was at, because Sarah at the end of her life had not yet shot a gun at somebody. She saw him do it, but she herself had never had to live through the consequences of what it means to shoot somebody innocent or shoot somebody that was questionable, that wasn't infected. And so the fact that Joel kind of put Ellie at that level where he didn't want her to ever pass that threshold, kind of does a really weird thing where it's like he was really trying to keep Ellie from having to get more gritty than Sarah ever had to get, but which he as a survivor had to get. Is like
Right.
there's totally a connection with, I think, how innocent Sarah was and how he was trying to preserve that for Ellie.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And so he does eventually, a scene or two later, properly give her the gun. And you pointed out that he doesn't thank her, but he does apologize to her
Yeah.
for putting her in the situation where she did have to use it. But since she used it, and she's apparently used it before in some capacity, we don't know yet. And because the reality of the situation is what it is, he gives her the gun. He shows her how to hold it correctly so it can't be yanked away easily. And even though he tells her to put it in her backpack, she pulls a sly one and sticks it in her jacket pocket again. So once again, I'm predicting that that will come in handy in the future, that she has a gun in her jacket pocket and not in her backpack.
Oh, so we don't think she'll blow her ass off by accident, like you
I don't
said?
think that is going to happen.
It's very I threw, obviously our forte, or my forte, is Harry Potter,
I
but
had the
I
same thought.
kept thinking about the Mad Eye Moody, um don't stick your wand in your back pocket because you'll blow your buttock off. And then somebody's like,
Right.
who do you know, or Tonks says to him, who do you know that's lost a buttock?
Right.
um
I
yeah,
had
but
the same thought. Yeah.
it's fair. It's a very that line though. And I want to talk to you in our spoiler section, which we save for the end of the episode, about what you think Ellie might mean by it wasn't the first time that I've shot somebody, like where that might have come into play that we know of. But in the moment, I was wondering if it wasn't just to make him feel better, because I think that Ellie at this point would issue a statement like that just to get him, who's presupposed on, I've caused you all this grief, I've caused you to lose your innocence or whatever. I feel like she would say that just to get him to stop thinking those things.
Right. And I think the implication is that she's clearly not talking about in the convenience store in episode 3 where she dug the knife
Yeah,
into the infected head. I wouldn't think she's talking about that either, just to put that
yeah.
out.
So we'll talk about that more for
Yeah.
sure. But yeah, I mean, this was the road episode that really I wasn't expecting and was thrilled that we got.
Mhm.
They really are together. The absence of Henry and Sam until the end allows us to focus on strictly Joel and Ellie's growth and change. The pun book coming out is really great, like multiple times. And, the first time they had to kill a man to survive or kill multiple men,
Mhm.
which reminds me, we need to upgrade the Joel kill count. Joe kill count is now going to go. So if Ellie made the first shot on the third guy, does that count as half for Ellie? And then we're going to give Joel 2.5 for this episode.
Uh, sure.
I mean, we
Joel,
could make it Joel 3, but I feel like Ellie helped, so I don't want to
she
shortchange her.
did. She did. But he did deliver the killing blow, I assume, with the knife that the guy offered as
The guy's like, "This is
a
a good
peace offering.
knife." Yeah, and then Joel's like, "Okay, I'll use it on you." Like,
You know,
I'm glad they didn't show it. Again, it's kind of more shocking for us to imagine it,
yeah.
rather than showing it specifically. But yeah, I would agree, going back to what we are talking about as far as Joel, his ruminations on innocence and the fact that he's killed innocent people. I think that if we see this in next episode as the midway point, and they are both directed by the same director, they're
Mhm.
both set, we assume, in this Kansas City area. So it's a wonderful kind of almost two-part mini part of the show that is focused on this type of thing. I think it's perfect to be having this overall theme be the people Joel's killed that may or may not have deserved it, the loss of innocence, Joel's preoccupation with having Ellie all of a sudden have a gun and use it and have to use it to survive. All of these things make perfect sense as a perfect reflection of what's to come, non-spoiler, but it feels like the right thing to be ruminating on the midway point of the series. Although I'm terribly sad to think that the series could be half over next week.
Yeah, no kidding.
I mean, it's so good.
Well, there's a couple of characters we haven't really even talked about yet from this week's episode, and that is the new additions to the story. We've got Kathleen, who is the leader of what was formerly a resistance, it seems. No longer resistance if they win, right?
Oh, I
Um,
guess she's still got a chip on her shoulder though. She's still resisting this the dissidents, the people that maybe helped them achieve their goals but didn't go all the way.
right,
Uh
right.
Giving Kathleen, who we do not know about from the show, giving Kathleen a motivation that like regardless of us knowing her or not, ties into somebody that we do know but who isn't being shown, is a separate stroke of genius. This idea that Kathleen is hunting Henry,
Mhm,
who this relationship is not in the game. Henry is presumably not known directly by any of the hunters.
mhm,
He's just a guy that is trying to get his kid brother out of Pittsburgh, um, making this more of a direct connection. And as Druckmann said in the behind the scenes of the episode, he loves personifying some of these groups of people. In the game, they're just an obstacle. And that was, I think, a perfect word for them because they really don't have a leader. They really aren't shown to have much of a real set of objectives. Now you have in this character of Kathleen, she's manipulating the crowd that has overthrown their QZ. She's manipulating them into fighting for her cause by going directly after Henry by saying he's responsible for the death of our people. And she
yeah,
doesn't know that. She has no indication of that at all. But it's useful and convenient for her to blame the men that Joel killed on this person that she personally wants either revenge for. It was implied that Henry had something to do with the death of Kathleen's brother, maybe, based on her interrogation of the doctor. So
mhm.
it's really just this complex, interwoven personal narrative, and it feels personal while still explaining masses of people and what they're doing in Kansas City.
Yeah, I thought it was a really good addition in sort of contextualizing where Henry and Sam are, and we get some additional information about who Henry and Sam might be, or some information about them without having to meet them yet. When she finds their sort of little hideout where there's cans of food that are finished and there's superhero drawings all over the wall.
So
And
what have we
you know
learned
that there
about
was a
them?
kid.
We've learned they like canned food,
Mhm.
or have to eat canned food,
Right.
and that Sam is very creative.
Yeah. And, you know, did you ever feel any sympathy towards Kathleen in this episode?
Did I feel sympathy? Yeah, yeah,
You did?
probably.
Okay. I
Um,
was I did not, but I'm
oh,
curious to
okay.
hear what kind of sympathy you feel for
This
her. And I'm not saying that to feel sympathy
no, no,
for
no,
her as
no, no,
well.
no. I see her for what I think we're meant to believe she is, which is somebody that manipulates, that uses convenient situations to rally. Like, I think it's safe to say she doesn't think that Henry called in a reinforcement that was a merc. Yeah. And like using a radio called somebody in that was going to kill some of her people. I think that she knows better than to assume that these deaths are the result of Henry. So the fact that she blames it on him to rally people to her cause, the fact that she is ignoring whatever's happening underground underneath one of the main buildings is very problematic, but also very human. The idea that she's trying to navigate everything is a damn house of cards, and it's gonna fall over any moment. And when Perry brings to her attention whatever's happening underground, infected breaking through the foundation, question mark, something sinister in the sewers, question mark, she wants to push it off. She just says, let's deal with that. Like, can we deal with this now? Is because she feels personally so close to enacting whatever revenge or whatever plot she's on. Where I felt sympathy for her was just in that human connection where it's like, girl, same. I have House of Cards fun every day. Feels like there's so much going on. Can we focus on one thing? Like, wouldn't it be nice if this one thing goes right that I'm trying to work on? So maybe not sympathy is like the right word for it, but Melanie Linsky, an actress who I've known for 16 years now, since first seeing her in Peter Jackson's Heavenly Creatures, which is not a happy movie. By the way, her and Kate Winslet are in it, and it's a great film. It's Peter Jackson pre-Lord of the Rings.
Based on a true story.
It's all frightfully romantic.
Heavenly Creatures.
She plays these exact roles very, very well, which is it's somebody who is can be domineering, can be in charge, but nevertheless has this vulnerable side that is not, she'll never appear cold. She'll appear damaged, but it'll never be because there's no humanity in her. And I think that's exactly why she's the perfect person for this role, because specifically they're trying to show a human face to the hunters from the video game, and the hunters in the video game just had no humanity at all. So I think those are just my thoughts on Kathleen as a character.
Okay. I mean, I like that we have a face for her. I like that we have a sort of person to root against as the villain, quote unquote, rather than just like these faceless, endless spawns of enemies like it is in a video game, because that's what a video game needs.
Yeah.
But my notes say exactly what I think Druckmann said in the behind the scenes for this episode, that this shows that sometimes the good guys can be just as bad as the bad guys. They're just as cruel. And she's putting everything behind this guise of seeking vindication for the people they've lost. But if you are turning around and doing the same thing to the people who oppressed you, is that really fair? Is that really being the good guys? Is that really doing what you should do as a human being? She kills her own doctor who delivered her when she was a baby.
Do you know your doctor that delivered you?
I think he's still alive. I do not know him.
That's exactly my answer to that same question. Like, I know the guy's name because as a child, my mom would drive us by the office that he then had like a private practice in. It would be like, there's his office. Like, what are the odds that in a giant city, I'm assuming Kansas City is probably pretty big. It shares across 2 states.
Yeah.
So like, what are the odds you would ever meet in an adult capacity, the doctor that brought you into the world long enough for him to be like, I brought you into this world. And also he doesn't remember that unless it's like, unless he knew her parents and like they kept in touch.
Yeah, it's got to be that kind of situation.
Yeah,
where,
it's
like,
got to be, but that's
yeah.
such a small town. Like, if he were the one doctor in the middle of like a rural part of Kansas, then I would believe that it's like, I brought you into this world. I've seen you grow up. Like, it's like having your like first pastor or somebody like, you know, that you're still in contact with. This doctor, the doctors who deliver babies do it 20 times a day, every day of a year for 30 plus years, however old Melanie Linsky is. Like, he doesn't, there's no connection there. So for him to be like, I brought you into this world is a really clever bit of writing because she's about to take him out of this world. And it's like this rejection of ownership. It's this rejection of like dominion, where she's like, I understand that I should feel like indebted to you, but I can't use you and you're just not usable and I'm going to kill you, as in like retribution of the fierce. It's very much like none of this shit that is past matters anymore, is like her approach. And I can't help but agree that it's harder to see what from the past is valuable, what from the past we can use, because if he is in fact harboring Henry, we don't know specifically what Henry is alleged to have done with Kathleen, although, as I said, I think it has something to do with her brother being beaten to death, which she tells the doctor. Then, you know, if he really is harboring that information or not going to give it up, she's the one in position to make these calls. She goes in and shoots him. It's not an immediate thing. She has to go back after more people have died, and then she decides to do it. So I sympathize with that. But yeah, she's just the person making this call, and just I understand feeling trapped or feeling like you can't afford to be ultimately very generous, because if you're in that leadership role, especially with the paramilitary type people that are following you, you can't really be seen to show weakness. So the fact that she gets to do this in private is itself a blessing. But yeah, I think it's a perfect iteration of showing that people are struggling. This group managed to overthrow their QZ with like and kill all of Fedra without being fireflies. So I also like this idea, which is very much a part of The Last of Us Part 2, which is there are so many other groups, and almost like regional, like per region, so many groups that aren't the fireflies or aren't Fedra that exist, that have taken over cities, that have taken over huge swaths of the population, and each one has their own story, their own purpose. And so I actually felt more than anything that the character of Kathleen being personifying these hunters was very much a more thing that The Last of Us Part 2 would have done if given the chance in defining Kansas City or Pittsburgh. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have much else to add, and I don't think she necessarily needs to be sympathetic. We don't have to humanize villains to the point that we sympathize with them necessarily. I mean, clearly she's gone through it. Everybody in this world has gone through it, but to take your hardships and to create hardships for other people out of it is a problem for me.
You know, I
mean,
think
I guess that what makes her a good villain. So
yeah, I think I want to backtrack and say I don't actually sympathize with her. I feel that it is that we were getting as a human person with human motivation.
I get that.
Yeah, kind of almost not empathize, but I can see the position she's in. But no, the people, because when I look at the kind of media I don't like, and this is what, you know, the kind of show that I think a lot of people are thinking The Last of Us show might be, which are those very bleak shows where the innocents always die. People who genuinely don't deserve it get gunned left and right, and you're just left wondering what's the point, kind of like what Ellie asked Joel in this episode. What's the point? If you can't hope, why even go on? But for me, I think that this, especially the show, even more than the game, is going to give us something to hope about, maybe, or they're just leading us on. But this character of Kathleen is meant to show us what to do when you don't live with hope, when all you have are the actions that are in front of you. And you know, they did this crazy thing, which is overthrow their QZ, and they're surviving. But if you look at how they're doing it, at like hoodwinking people and taking supplies from you know, these people that happen to wander into their things and lying to her own people about what the real threats are, that's the wrong way to go about kind of the power that she's obtained.
Yeah, I like what you just said about her sort of being the opposite of Joel, where Joel says the thing to go about every day and to keep me going is family. And Tess was like family. Tommy is family. That's why I'm still trying every day. Um, and for her to have lost the family that she would have been
Yeah.
fighting for positively, or obviously not slaughtering more or less innocent people over. So yeah, I like that. Um, so is there anything else that's in the story here that we want to talk about that's not setting up next week?
Yeah, Ellie holding a gun. And it's interesting because there was all that attention at the first part of the episode about how Ellie hadn't shot anybody and Joel was trying to protect her from ever having to shoot anybody. And when he actually properly shows her how to hold a gun, she's like, "Oh, I know this." And he says, "Where do you learn that?" She says, "Fedra school." I'm like, "Yeah." Actually, it was called out back in the premiere. Like she's and we knew this from the video games. She was in a Fedra boarding school where she was placed, and they clear like she's 14, sure, which is kind of young, but in a pandemic world where you're fighting infected and you're trained, she would have held and shot a gun by now.
Well, I think
Um,
what Joel was pointing out in that moment was that she was holding it wrong. She
yeah,
was holding it with one hand.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and he shows her the right way, which is great.
right, right.
But the idea is not like if she grew up in a Fedra school, my point is he shouldn't have been surprised that she had shot or somebody before at all. Because I think by age 14, they'd have you doing like raids on infected or so, like there has to be a certain point at which they turn children over to go and shoot and fight and or at least train to do so. I mean, again, I'm just thinking about the game. So in the game, she says she
Mhm,
shot at rats with BB guns. That's
mhm.
because after they're in Pittsburgh, they're going through the hotel, and after she shoots the guy to protect Joel's life, he gives her the rifle. But again, not willingly. It's just because they have to. And he says, "You ever shoot one of these before?" And she says, "Yeah, BBs and rats." So contrast that with the TV show where she's like, "Yeah, I grew up in Fedra school and have used a gun before." ... Um, he just shouldn't have been surprised that she had ever shot somebody at the beginning of the episode, I think, if it's clear to him or if he knew that it was a Fedra school that she grew up in. It's kind of an inconsistency in my mind that I can't quite solve right yet.
Well, I will say I don't think Fedra is having them go out hunting infected or shooting other people. I think they're giving them basic gun safety. I think they're showing them how to hold it in the way that they hold it, which maybe isn't the most secure way, which is what Joel teaches her. Um, I think the whole point of Fedra, I mean, like we've talked about, I hate saying that. I'm sorry. Their slogan was to fight infection and insurrection, and so the kids that they're training in their schools are to one day be a part of Fedra, to be contributing members of society, and a large portion of that means joining their military units so that they can stop infection and insurrection. And so I think that every kid in a Fedric school is going to get gun training in some capacity. Um, and I think that the circumstances in which she would have used it on somebody or otherwise injured somebody are outside of that situation.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, if you're talking about fighting infected or fighting insurrection, well, who's insurrecting? It's the living people, the non-infected people.
Right.
Eventually, those Fedra kids will be trained to be adult Fedra guards and may come across a situation where these people that aren't infected are nevertheless trying to overthrow you and you have to defend yourself. I wonder what that training is like is kind of my thought process there. I love that Joel takes one look at how she holds a gun and is like, "No, that's dopey. That's not gonna
Right.
it's like, let me show you, child." And shows her a better way because again, she ultimately is going to learn a lot from him and he's going to teach her a lot. He doesn't necessarily want to. We know he's stated that he's uncomfortable doing it. But he nevertheless, because they're in this together, is going to teach her the survival skills that she needs. And I
Mhm.
appreciate that she's scared enough, even though there's quite a bit of the gleeful Ellie, the Ellie that loves excitement of danger. We did see some of that in this episode, the moments where she was actually turned on by the violence instead of repulsed. But there was at least a decent portion of those moments where she spends it either shook or shocked enough to listen to his instructions, to crawl quietly, to, she doesn't outright disobey him because she is scared. And I appreciate that dichotomy where like there's still plenty going on that scares her. And there's still some that's happening that you can still see those remnants of what they did with episode 1, where Ellie is enthralled by Joel protecting her.
Yeah. Well, I think there's something inherently scarier about being hunted by people than by monsters. You expect monsters to hunt you. You don't expect people to. And so I think that's automatically a scarier situation because these are people and they're supposed to be people with you and not hunt you down and shoot you or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is scarier. And there's an interesting contrast between this and in the previous episode where she does dig her knife into the infected head and almost relishes it to a certain extent. And then here she's instantly, as you said, shook. She sheds a couple tears, wipes them away. This is a scary thing. It's different when it's a person that you're dealing with. Just overall, it's a different thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I like that contrast because where Ellie might have been confident after having been like, yeah, I stuck my knife in an infected head. It's not a big deal. That used to be a person. And then the reality of like, this is what happens when you injure or kill an actual living person who's not infected, who's just like you or me, in theory, that it's just a way more traumatizing thing.
Yeah, and I don't trust the words that guy was saying. I actually turned on subtitles because I couldn't understand it. But he is calling for his mommy. He's saying, "You can
Mhm.
take me to her." Again, can't feel my legs. These are terrifying things. These are things that would break anybody's heart if you have to. If it turns out you had done this damage to somebody. But I think what's underscored by the fact that Joel does kill him is not how much of a monster Joel is, but how you really can't trust
Mhm.
anything that this guy is saying. There could have been any number of reasons why this guy would have either taken them into a deeper trap or something. The guy needed to go.
Yeah, I think he was stalling. I mean,
Yeah.
2 minutes after he's dead and Joel escapes into the next room, the other people show up. So
There you go. So,
yeah.
I mean, in terms of like ends justifying the means, no, it's a horrible scene. Like every death is unfortunate. And you're right. There is a complete difference when the people trying to kill you are other humans.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that really much. Yeah. And I think this may carry us through to beginning to talk about the future and therefore through our spoiler curtain. Spoiler time. This is a section of the show placed behind a spoiler warning because, as Pedro Pascal says,
some things must stay sacred.
if you don't want to be spoiled, keep the rest of the episode sacred, and we'll see you next week. Here we go. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay. Spoilers. One thing I was getting ready to feel apprehensive about was the lack of infected in the show. If you cut out long range shots, there have been like 3 infected, and it was the clickers in episode 2. So I was really worried. And also just in general, even episode 3 had some, like the Raiders, but like they were not really shown for very long. It's like, man, where is all the action? I understand Neil Druckmann is quoted as saying too, the game is an action game. It had to be an action game. We couldn't do any of this other cool stuff about the drama. But I'm still going as an adaptation of an action game in this TV series. Where is the action? Where is it? Because I slightly have been starting to feel like I might mourn the loss of some of these huge, intense sequences. And I want a fully intense action episode. I do. I want it this season too. Not to say I don't appreciate all the drama, not to say I don't appreciate literally every choice they've made that's detracted. I've loved. If I really lay it out, I've loved every single choice. And that's weird to just love every single choice, but like I really do. But I'm starting to miss the action. And I think at least with this Kansas City situation, We got the standoff in this episode. And from the preview, which is why this is in the spoiler section that I'm mentioning this, from the preview, there's a bloater coming at some point.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what was pushing through the ground in Kansas City. So next episode might be our huge infected action sequence where there's clickers everywhere and the bloater comes in and then everybody's like, oh shit. So, okay, I feel like maybe that's where all the action went to, is like just the middle of the season instead of showing it every episode. So I feel like it'll pay off. But I was worried there for a minute. I was worried there that this would just be a human drama that might as well be taking place anywhere at any time and not really have as many infected or other people to shoot.
Okay, so I am excited to see the action sequence in the next episode. And I'm sure there'll be one or two more big ones throughout the rest of the season. But maybe a hot take, it's not the thing I'm tuning in for. Like,
Okay.
sure, it's going to be cool to see how they handle the bloater in the next episode. Like, I'd like to theorize a little bit about that in a minute. But The Last of Us, the phrase The Last of Us, does not refer to the zombies.
Nah.
It refers to the people who are left,
Yeah,
right? And
right.
all of the conflicts and politics and back and forth conflicts that they are getting into, even still, because humans can't stay out of conflict with each other. Even when they have this thing to unify them,
Yeah.
to stand against the things that have torn apart the world, it's the fact that they are still fighting with each other. Like, this episode is a prime example of that. That's what The Last of Us is about. And so, do I think the clickers looked really great in episode 2? Yeah, I think the bloater looks pretty sick too. I'm really excited to see it.
It's amazing.
But it's not why I'm tuning in.
Yeah.
And I think even when you get to the video games, like, the zombie sequences aren't the things that stand out to me.
Okay.
But like I said, maybe that's a hot take. Maybe
No,
that's a
I
hot
mean,
take.
well, I'm not watching necessarily for the action sequences either, the big set pieces that are going to blow up. But I'd be remiss if I didn't expect some of them to, like, there hasn't been, we're getting them in different ways, and we're getting them in
Right.
budget, cost friendly ways that are, I haven't looked at something yet and gone, that was so incredibly ambitious from an explosion standpoint, an action standpoint. This the State House thing, maybe I'm overreacting here, because the State House explosion was actually really cool.
Mhm.
But yes, I'm also tuning in for the human element. Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey have done so much more acting and so much more fleshing out their characters than I think I ever expected out of an adaptation on TV, and I want them to continue doing that. But I would say that getting into the action, if you want to look at, okay, so you said it's The Last of Us, it's all about the people, it's not necessarily about the infected. The parallels that were drawn, or the indication that humans cause the infected, that humans cause through global warming this cordyceps infection, shows that any scene with the infected is also about human interaction, is also about humanity, is also about humanity's failure. So it's not just when people are fist fighting each other or somebody's got Joel by the throat and a gun. It's literally a scene between Joel and a clicker also reflects that same failure of man versus man, not because Joel's facing a clicker who used to be a man, although that's probably true, but because this was all caused by humanity. So what Joel is facing is what anybody who fights a clicker is facing in this world, is the failures of their own ancestors, essentially, and the failures of the human condition. And so I don't think we need to ignore the infected just because they're not man versus manny enough. I think they are man versus manny enough. And I think you can still tell an interesting story facing off against the infected that still has drama and still has those stakes of, like, what have we done? The world, if we show a room with 50 infected, like, they used to be people, and you should play that up as being like, holy shit, we really effed up here. So I just, at some point before the end of the season, I would like to get like a massive infected kind of scene, and then I'll be happy, and then it'll just be done. But I don't have a problem with, again, I'm literally, like, every time I try and find something I disagree with, I can't. Everything in this show so far is good. Like, I'm trying, it's really good, and I can see why things are being changed.
Right. The only thing I'm saying, I agree with you. It is a different version of man versus man conflict.
Okay.
But I mean, next episode, when we see the bloater, we've seen it all. Until we get to part 2,
You're right.
we've seen it all.
You're right. And
Like,
I don't
that's
want to
it.
go even beyond the bloater necessarily at
Yeah.
all. Right? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Right. So, I mean, do we need to get if we get the big set piece scene in the next episode, then we don't quote need more. Now, will we probably get more? Probably. Yeah. But again, it's just not the thing that's bringing me back every single week. And one more thing to again argue against. I'm going back and forth, and that's okay.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Would I have been upset if they had done the zombies and the clickers and all that kind of stuff poorly? Yes, obviously. But because they've done it so well, I don't necessarily need to see tons of it. So I'm glad we're getting more next week. I'm really eager to see if he throws like a propane tank at the bloater and shoots it, and like that's how they take care of it. I don't know.
No,
I don't know
it's your. I'm gonna play your barrel roll clip. The barrel roll,
Yeah,
shotgun,
barrel roll,
shotgun.
barrel roll.
Yeah. No, I love that so much.
But yeah, and then the only other thought I had was we get a lot more of the what has mankind wrought in making this infected thing happen in part 2, depending on how closely they follow that when we get to like the ground zero in Seattle.
Okay, fair.
Yeah. And we see the failures of like containment and stuff like that. But
yeah,
anyways.
no, I'd like to see this. What do you make of, and I wanted to ask you this, probably during the regular episode, but it's better that it's here behind the spoilers. What do you make of Joel's comment? It's kind of a blink and you miss it thing. Ellie asks them when they're camping in the woods the first night after their days-long drive. She asks, would there be any infected out here? And Joel says, it's too remote for infected. What does that mean? What do you take that to mean?
It's like a virus, right? A virus is only goal in life is to reproduce itself. And so if the infected are hanging out in the trees, there's nobody there typically. They need to go to the populated centers. And that brings up something I read in the Wikipedia summary for this episode. Apparently that the crumbling ground, the rumbling, the roars or whatever we hear in that garage that Kathleen and Perry show us, I thought that's just a bloater, right? But the Wikipedia summary, at least, and I don't know where they get this, but they say that is infected burrowing into the city to get close to people. So I think that, I mean, the fungi is all interconnected. It has roots and it's spread out everywhere. And so it's going to naturally gravitate to where it can create more of itself. And the forest is not the best place for them to do that.
It's funny because have you watched much of The Walking Dead?
No.
Okay.
I don't care if you spoil it for me or for
No.
else.
This is not a very this won't be a spoiler to truly anybody, I don't think. There's a scene where I forget how many years past it's been since the world ended. But the infected, the Walking Dead in The Walking Dead, have almost a limitless energy source. They're just like, I forget how they even stay alive. There's a point where a character goes to a dock at like this pond in a rural area, and they're looking into the water, and they're standing over the edge of the dock looking into the water, and the camera pans down, and in this pond there's an infected person that is still around. They don't reach up, they don't grab the person in, they don't do anything, but the point is that the thing is there and it's alive, and it needed no food source, it needed no batteries, it's there. And so when I think about what the world of The Last of Us TV series is looking like, I wonder if, as a fungus at that basically through intention or not is coating the earth the way we see it in the opening titles, I wonder if there isn't really still a threat in the middle of nowhere of having just this runner or somebody that well, at this point probably be a clicker or worse, but really wouldn't there have been, we're talking about what, 60% of the human population, I think it said somewhere, was lost. Some of that is dead, and a lot of them apparently when they turn die, according to something Joel said earlier in an episode. But I still believe that you gotta have some threat in the boonies of infected, because otherwise, aren't the boonies safe? Like, that's the weird thing. I know Joel says they're under more of a threat from real people seeing their fire, or whatever it is that Ellie assumes he means, but I still wouldn't feel fully comfortable. And I think about this a lot when I think about The Last of Us in the last couple of weeks. If they were to ever get the cure and be able to administer some kind of vaccine, not necessarily heal the people that have already been infected, but prevent future people from being infected, the way to reclaim the world is literally having to go into every bus station, every downtown subway corner crack, and eradicate every fungal infected person of all time. Presuming you could even do that, to literally go where any human could have accidentally found themselves in a crack if they were infected and just like fell somewhere. You have to go and eradicate all of that. Is that not then a risk that they could go somewhere in the middle of nowhere and find that infected that Ellie found in the last episode that's still dangerous, completely immobilized, but could still turn you, well, if you're not Ellie.
Right.
So is the threat real? Is the threat like the nascent threat of somebody like, if you come across an infected in the middle of nowhere, what doesn't sit right with me is that Joel was like, it's too remote, period. That I want more of an explanation as to why he really doesn't feel like the infected would be there. And what you said makes sense, that if it were a virus, it would go where it can replicate. But to me, it's like these people could just be left there accidentally and still be in the woods and still come and kill you. Like, you should be more of a, like, feel threatened by that.
Yeah, while you were talking, I was kind of looking through information from the game, like what is the timeline for all these various levels of infected, like runners to stalkers to clickers to bloaters, right? And I haven't found it's hard to do both, and I'm not going to spend a long time looking at it right now. But the thing is, most infected don't reach bloater stage, right? Like we saw in the first episode, Tess and Joel came across an infected that had sort of just grown into the wall. Like that one obviously wasn't going to progress any further down the pathway. And I think it's rare for an infected to reach the stage where they get to bloater. Like even clickers are rarer. If every infected turned into a runner, turned into a clicker, turned into a bloater, there'd be bloaters everywhere and not runners and clickers.
Yeah.
So I think they have to reproduce pretty quickly in order to create more of themselves consistently. Otherwise, it's unlikely. Like I think in theory, one clicker could get lucky and survive long enough to become a bloater and just sort of like hang out in an area until somebody unsuspecting comes around. But I think it's the virus mindset. They have to be around somewhere where they can reproduce easily.
That makes perfect sense to me. So it really does seem like metropolitan areas are just the most obvious place to avoid for both the resources that people will find and the infected. One thing I'm looking forward to next week answering is just surely the bloater was not once a petite human being, maybe like a diminutive, like very quiet, shy person, very wallflower type character. The bloater, I think, no matter how many layers of fungus you have or add to somebody, the bloater would have had to have been kind of a big dude to begin with. I'm wondering if the show will address that, honestly. Not specifically, but not everyone can become a bloater. And in fact, if you look at the clickers that we've seen and that are just everywhere in the game are emaciated. They're thin people that make them very agile, but that's not compatible with the bloater as this giant, guttural kind of gluttonous kind of character.
Well, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume either that bloaters are just covered in like thicker and thicker layers of the fungus.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you look at how big his hand is, though, it's like this was a big dude. This is like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's like, like they got Ani. Yeah.
So I'm finding right here, this is the Last of Us wiki. Bloaters take years. A clicker is about 1 year down the path. Yeah.
What's 1 year?
A clicker is about a year.
Oh, only a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it just makes sense that we keep finding runners and keep finding clickers because more people keep turning. I mean, truly, like as survivors get killed or get turned, there's a constant influx. Yeah, I mean, there's a 5-year difference. I was reading this between parts 1 and part 2 of The Last of Us. So by the time you get to Seattle in part 2, it's easily been 25 years since the outbreak. And that makes sense because we also see Patient Zero, who's evolved into something beyond a bloater. You also see that alternate path. I forget what they're called. Shambler, maybe. It's like a bloater, but it evolved differently because of the presence of water. I think those are called shamblers. And yeah, you see like the alternate evolutionary path. So I like that. But yeah, it's clear that those are the bigger, longer kind of progressions. I just wonder if anybody in next week's episode has already seen one before. Or if they'll all be like, holy crap, what?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more of that. Now,
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think is going to happen to Kathleen and Pierce? Do you think they're going to meet their ends at the hands of another person? Do you think they're going to meet their ends at the hands of infected of some sort? Or are they going to live happily ever after, more or less, at least not dead?
I want to answer that question by asking you, what do you think Henry did to Kathleen specifically? What amount of culpability for Kathleen's brother's death do you really think Henry has? Again, we haven't seen Henry in this show utter one word yet. But do you think it's likely, knowing the character, can you see where they're trying to say he did something that's causing her to hunt him? Like, what did he do? And the reason I ask is, in this question about how Kathleen and Perry will end up, do they have culpability? Like, will they go too far in trying to enact revenge? Is Henry like responsible for something truly awful? Because if Henry is responsible for something truly awful, and then that makes Kathleen a sympathetic character, I'm more inclined to say that her ignorance of the problem growing beneath the garage or whatever will not do her in, and that she'll have a more personal fate, like trying to kill Henry and then or Sam, and then Henry defends, that kind of a thing. Versus just being killed by the bloater. Like, I'm trying to figure out what this angle is between Kathleen and Henry, whether they're going to have a in-person confrontation, whether you think it's leading to that.
I think there will be some sort of confrontation, because I think that's sort of what the nature of Kathleen existing and her having this vendetta leads to. I think the implication is that Henry gave over some sort of information that led to the capture and subsequent beating and killing of her brother. And my guess would be Henry, as the older brother and only guardian of Sam, traded information for the ability to be able to continue taking care of his brother. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll find out. But I'm sure they'll have some sort of confrontation. I'm curious to see how they handle what we know happens to Sam, which is that he becomes infected, and Henry has to kill him and then kills himself, and it's really sad. And we're gonna tear our hearts out again next week.
Yep.
But it's got to happen somewhat different this time around, right? I don't know. Looking back at that now, it kind of feels very similar to what happens to Tess. Like, all of a sudden we get through the end of the big conflict, and I've been bit. I'm infected now.
That's a great point.
I don't want it to be the exact same thing. So I wouldn't mind a slight change to what happens to Sam. Now, I do think it's important that the ultimate outcome is the same. Like, Sam, in my mind, needs to be infected, and Henry needs to deal with it. And that's like the tragedy of those characters.
Yeah.
But I just think the how we get there is going to be different. Whether it's like, I don't know, maybe Kathleen and Perry do something, or I don't know if Perry would go that low. I think he's already shown maybe some hesitation in following Kathleen. We'll see. But I think Kathleen might be someone who would go do something so cruel as to like lock Sam in a room with an infected.
Yeah.
Like, and then Henry like takes her out maybe, or opens the door and the infected comes out and gets her instead, and he goes in only to find out that that Sam has been in. I don't know. I don't want to like overly predict.
No,
But
I like that take on it, that Kathleen would like indirectly harm Sam by like putting him in a room with an infected, which is not that indirect.
Right.
But if you look at how when she shot the doctor, it wasn't an immediate thing. She left the room, later came back and shot him because she doesn't like being the person that pulls the trigger. She prefers to not have that be her. She has all these mercs around her that are able and capable and more than willing, it seems, to do that. Yeah, I think Perry would probably go out fighting the bloater, because that seems to be what he likes. There's also, funnily enough, the fact that Joel in this episode kept talking about Tommy, how Tommy was happy to join the army, how he was sent to Desert Storm, how they knew, you know, all of this military experience around Tommy. Then you have the Tommy voice actor as this paramilitary character in this show who seems to want nothing more than to be her guard and to use his weapon on some infected or something, is a really exciting contrast they're drawing between Kathleen's person and Joel's brother, as like very excited to be involved in what they're in. I don't know what they're doing there, but there's something there that will become clearer as time goes on.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we know that we're going to get our hearts torn out in some capacity next week, which is excellent. Love that for us. I had a question regarding Henry and Sam. Do you think they followed Joel and Ellie? Is that how we came to this situation?
That's a great question. I was wondering, because there's that line where Kathleen says, "They're close, I can feel it," or "He's close, I can feel it." If I were in the former QZ and I were trying to get out for whatever reason, I would probably be looking at that entrapment location, which in the game is actually very cleverly drawn out on a map. It says ambush here, turn there. They basically move the trucks and the cars and all the vehicles so that the only road you can take is the one that leads you directly into the ambush point.
Right.
If I were Henry and Sam in a realistic version of what happens in the game, I would potentially try and scout that area out for allies, especially because it would be like, "Hi, welcome to hell. We're also like, we know you don't want to be here, and we're also trying to leave here. Won't you help us?" But I also don't know if it is just Henry and Sam and say they each have one gun apiece. I don't know that it would be safe enough or worth their time to actually try and recruit, like, by waiting for somebody to fall into the trap, waiting for somebody to free themselves, and then asking those people for help, which could be what happened. More often than not, or more likely, I think, is that maybe they were in this building, that they were in this skyscraper, and only maybe they were on the 34th floor, and, you know, happened to see the flashlight going up and down the stairs, or Ellie read one of her puns, and they're like, "Well, we know these people aren't part of the resistance, so let's give them a chance to explain themselves," and maybe that's it. I don't get the sense that they really followed them that long. But
I'm going to make another prediction.
Yes.
We've already established that this episode was very clearly a part 1, and next episode is clearly a part 2. They're directed by the same person. They take place in the same place. I bet we did not get a flashback in this episode. First episode, we have not gotten a flashback of any kind. Next episode, we're going to get like, this is what Henry and Sam have been doing. This is the events that led them to here. And it will end with them catching wind of Joel and Ellie and following them or happening upon them somehow. And then we are caught up, and then the rest of the episode progresses.
Oh my God, I love that. I love that. It would explain everything. It seems fated to happen. I love the prediction. I love predictions in general, especially good ones. No, that's fantastic. Well, was there anything else that you wanted to mention that might have to do with the future?
I don't think so. I think we've covered everything that I had in my notes in all areas.
I've just found 3 more things from my notes. So
okay,
we're driving into Kansas City. They're all quick. We're driving into Kansas City. Obviously, this world ended in 2003. The movies, there's a movie theater. The movies that are playing at this movie theater, as indicated by the marquee, are Underworld, which features Kate Beckinsale as an undead vampire as she faces off against undead werewolves. Very cool stuff. Very, very prescient choice of films from 2003 to showcase. And Matchstick Men, featuring Nicolas Cage, and I forget who plays his brother, as con artists. And Sam Rockwell. I saw both of these films in theaters. So
Wow,
this
I
was
did
the
not.
this was the first time where the whole 2003, and I'm like, I'm vaguely aware I was alive in 2003 and like young or whatever. This was the first time seeing those movies on the billboard going, wait, I actually was in theaters seeing these movies in theaters, and I felt old for the very first time. I was like, man, that was 20 years ago.
You said Matchstick Men is a heist film?
Well, it's
What
about
did you
con
say it was?
artists. I couldn't say it's actually, I can't remember if they actually steal something.
I was just curious. I didn't know if maybe these would be hints to what happens at the future.
Well, that's a good, because Underworld is very clear. The undead, the vampire thing is like very much like zombies, infected, all this stuff. And there's a lot of good action. But yeah, Matchstick Men, I wouldn't say whatever I was expecting the movie to be, it wasn't. It was just mostly a character drama between the two characters, and I think of either a femme fatale or somebody that they string along. So the movie was unremarkable from what I can recall. But I did pay to go see it in theaters, and probably still have my ticket stub about 5 feet from where I'm sitting now. So that was a fun fun little thing to mention. I also wanted to mention the Doritos vending machine, because how satisfying is it? I know I'm satisfied to actually be able to see brand names that I recognize on TV, because the video game, it doesn't matter in the video game, but you also will never, ever get a Doritos vending machine in the video game. The fact that in the adaptation, they have real life brands, real life, like, just immerses you like much more satisfactorily. I think in the game, you're kind of get used to the generic brands that are in the game world. Every movie poster is Dawn of the Wolf 2. It's just like, okay, get on with it. But being able to actually see some real world things, because it's a TV show that's supposed to be set in this world, and because they paid Doritos $1 million to do it, really is satisfying. Actually, I think it just really adds that extra level of specialness to the show.
Yeah, and there was also a billboard or something in that same, may not have been the same shot, but around that time, and I couldn't really tell what the billboards were or if they were meant to be anything. They were like half torn, so that'd be interesting to know if that was a thing.
Yeah, I bet somebody probably went back and is like, this was the same people that are analyzing like Joel and Ellie's like shirts and t-shirts in the show, is like, which it turns out they're exactly like they were in the game, but it's like nobody would ever realize that, because you never get a straight shot.
Right.
So that's real cool. But
anything else?
I think I'll just say that is it for now.
I guess it would be appropriate to read. I think I went over these lyrics just a little bit earlier, but from the Alone and Forsaken lyrics.
Please first off, Hank Williams, everybody.
First off, I wasn't aware of this. I love that the chapter in the game is called Alone and Forsaken, and then the chapter in this show is called Please Hold to My Hand. So you have two chapters that take place similarly that both have lyrics from the same song, and the songs featured in both. That's really great. I
pointed out to you while I was streaming, the song on the radio is the song on the radio in the game.
Right. That's what I said. Yeah. So the chorus, which is really the only relevant part to what is going on. Otherwise, it's kind of a love song or like lost love song. But the chorus is alone and forsaken by fate and by man. Oh Lord, if you hear me, please hold to my hand. That's appropriate for sure. Alone and forsaken by fate and by man. That's can't think of a line that sort of fits
as
into
more
the world
relevant.
of The Last of Us even better.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And the fact that it's this old country song from 50, 60 years ago is just like, wow, this is really relevant. I wanted to talk about the closing credits song.
I'm not familiar with this song. Well, I mean,
Awesome.
not to say I was familiar with Hank Williams, but
so do you not have the album? Is there vinyl you don't have? That's The Last of Us Part 2 covers and rarities. album?
I don't know if I have that one I don't know if I have any of the original Last of Us vinyl.
Okay.
I have The Last of Us 2, both of the ones that they've made of that.
Okay, because The Last of Us 2 covers and rarities features a song sung by Ashley Johnson and Chris Rondinella, which is a cover version, not the version that appears in the show, but it's a song called True Faith, which is the song that ends this show. And Ashley Johnson covered it for the Last of Us Part 2 Covers and Rarities album.
Okay, so this is the one that we both purchased semi-recently, right?
Is it? It might be on that same record. All I did was,
I'm
I'll be
looking it
honest,
up.
I played that for Wayfaring Stranger, and I kept putting on Wayfaring Stranger, Wayfaring Stranger, and so I don't know that this was the one that we just purchased.
True Faith. Yeah,
True
it's
Faith.
on there. Yeah,
Okay.
so this is me revealing that I haven't spun that record at all yet.
That's okay. I felt very bad saying I spun just Wayfaring Stranger, but I love that song.
Yeah.
Okay, so True Faith is on that record. Well, True Faith, the version in the closing credits of this week's episode is by Lottie Kessner, but the original was from New Order, who have a song called Blue Monday, which is very synth, very awesome. Their version of True Faith debuted, guess what decade? Pick a decade.
I already know the answer, so
It's the 80s.
yeah, it's the 80s. So
It's 1987. Trouble. New Order. So they managed to sneak another 80s song into by giving it a really, I don't know when the cover was by Lottie Kessner, but it's an amazing cover. And New Order is a great band. I don't know that I know this particular song, but yeah, it's another 80s song. I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
Yeah. Let's see. So this cover is from 2011, it says, and on the Mondo track listing for that vinyl record, it says that the version sung by Ashley Johnson on there is inspired by this cover. So
yep, that's kind of how I found who the original, because there's about 10 versions on Spotify. But so this means, and I'm sure we'll both be hearing about this on the official Last of Us podcast. I'm sure it'll get mentioned. But the idea that this song existed in the game world prior to Craig Mazin just picking a song like they said he did with the one at the end that ended the premiere. This song must have a deeper connection with Druckmann and the Last of Us universe than we ever could have guessed. Because it appears on that track from the Last of Us 2 Covers and Rarities album and is being covered and included in the show.
Yeah, I'm glancing through lyrics right now, and it does seem like a very Ellie kind of song. So I don't know if we want to spend the time on that right now, but
it's another song that the songwriter said was about drugs and taking a trip. And what would you do if that trip ruined your life?
It's the 80s, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I guess that's true. Trouble. But yeah, so the going from the Hank Williams song, which was in the game, now in the show, made a very successful trailer for the show as well. The use of music is as good as ever, and will only, as we see, like persist, like a damn fungus breaking through the ground to sprout, is very much keeps going, and I just love it.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I don't have anything to add. I'm excited to get the conclusion of this part of the story as much as I can be excited for something that I know is going to break my heart.
Well, and apart from that, I don't know where it's going. I think you're right. It'll break our hearts, but I'm excited because at this juncture, it doesn't feel like they're rushing to the end that we already know, and that wouldn't be exciting if they were. So, and it was very much the right call not to have the bloater in the school with Bill last episode. That just wouldn't have made the same impact. So if they are keeping Infected on reserve for big moments, it's much more exciting to see it in a crowd of people in the middle of a downtown QZ, essentially, than in some school gymnasium. So this was a longer episode. I want to thank anybody who's made it this far in listening. And thank you, Chad, for being a part of it. I always love chatting with you and getting to do this.
Happy to spore with you.
Please email us, folks, if you're listening. We haven't actually got an email since we started this section, but the email address for the show, which I figured I'd call out in audio, is thankyouforspieling which is spieling @gmail.com. And I'll include in the show notes where you can find us both, as well as our other podcast projects, as I usually do. And yeah, I'm very super excited for next week and to keep going. This is just a wonderful, wonderful time.
Absolutely is. I would love to interact with people more on this too. So like reach out to us, look for that information in the show notes. Reach out to us on Twitter.
Yeah.
Or on YouTube or wherever you're listening.
@Chadadada and
yeah.
@Spielerman.
Yeah. Continue the conversation. I want to talk with people.
Let's do it. Cool. Well, thanks for sporing with me. And listeners, thank you for listening. And we'll catch you next week.
Bye.
Bye.